Case 1. Christa Pike. January 12, 1995. Knox County. The Job Corps campus in Knoxville, Tennessee, was meant to be a place of second chances. It was a federally funded program built to give young people from difficult backgrounds a path toward vocational training, stability, and a future many of them had never had reliable access to before. For 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, it was supposed to be exactly that. She had traveled from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, hoping to build a new life for herself. She had no way of knowing that the friendships she formed in Knoxville would ultimately cost her everything. Colleen crossed paths with a fellow student named Christa Pike, an 18-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, who had also come to the program hoping for a fresh start. On the surface, the two young women were classmates working toward the same goals. But underneath, a toxic web of jealousy, obsession, and rivalry was quietly forming, one that would erupt into one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's history. Christa Pike had begun a relationship with a fellow student named Tatterall Shipp. Investigators later learned that Pike had become consumed with jealousy, convinced that Colleen Slemmer was a romantic threat, someone who might come between her and Shipp. What began as suspicion curdled into obsession. Pike started to view Colleen not as a classmate, but as a rival to be eliminated. On the night of January the 12th, Pike lured Colleen away from the safety of the dormitory under false pretenses. She convinced her to walk with her to an isolated, wooded area on the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus, not far from where they lived. Tatterall Shipp came along. What followed, according to court records and testimony presented at trial, was over 30 minutes of sustained violence. Investigators would later describe it as one of the most difficult crime scenes they had ever processed, not because of its scale, but because of what it revealed about the premeditation and cruelty carried out by someone barely out of her teenage years. Colleen Slemmer did not survive the attack. Her body was discovered days later, and it did not take investigators long to zero in on Pike and Shipp as their primary suspects. Word had already begun to spread through the Job Corps campus that Pike had been making chilling remarks to classmates in the days that followed, remarks that horrified everyone who heard them and quickly drew the attention of investigators. That detail, more than almost anything else in the case, cemented public horror and became one of the defining elements of the prosecution's case. When the case went to trial, prosecutors argued that this was not a killing born of a single moment of rage, but a calculated act, planned and carried out with chilling composure. The jury agreed. In 1996, Christa Pike was convicted and sentenced to death, becoming, at the time, the youngest woman on death row in the United States. Tatterall Shipp, who was 17 at the time of the crime, was tried separately. Because of his age, he was spared the death penalty and instead received a sentence of life imprisonment. In the decades since her conviction, Christa Pike's case has become a fixture of true crime discussion, not only because of the severity of what occurred, but because of what it represents. A warning about how quickly obsession and jealousy can spiral into irreversible violence among young people navigating intense emotional environments. Pike has pursued multiple appeals over the years, each one denied. As of today, she remains on Tennessee's death row, the only woman currently held there. Her case continues to raise difficult questions about culpability, mental health, and the long shadow a single night can cast over every life it touches. Colleen Slemmer's family has spent the decades since fighting to keep her memory alive, refusing to let her be remembered only as a footnote in someone else's crime. Her story is a reminder that behind every case file is a young woman who had hopes for her own future, one that was taken from her far too soon. If this case has affected you, or if you or someone you know is struggling with intense feelings of jealousy, obsession, or thoughts of harming another person, please reach out to a mental health professional or a crisis line in your area. Support is available, and reaching out is never a sign of weakness. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2. Lindsey Lowe. September 12, 2011. Sumner County. On the surface, Lindsey Lowe seemed like an ordinary young woman living a quiet, unremarkable life with her parents in the suburban community of Hendersonville, Tennessee, just outside Nashville. She had graduated from Middle Tennessee State University, and to those around her, she gave no outward indication that anything in her life was in crisis. What no one around her knew, not her parents, not her friends, was that Lindsey was secretly pregnant and had been concealing that pregnancy for months. On the morning of September the 12th, 2011, while alone in her parents' home, Lindsey Lowe gave birth in secret in the bathroom. She had not told a single person about her pregnancy. She delivered not one but two infant boys, twins, in circumstances that investigators would later describe as isolated and desperate. In the chaotic, frightening moments that followed, according to the case against her, Lindsey smothered both infants in an effort to silence their cries, fearful of being discovered. She then concealed their small bodies inside a laundry hamper in her bedroom, where they remained undiscovered for 2 full days. It was only when a family member noticed something troubling that the infants were found, and Lindsey was taken into custody shortly after. The revelation shattered her family and her community, many of whom had no idea Lindsey had even been pregnant, let alone that 2 newborns had lost their lives inside a home that, from the outside, looked like any other on the street. Prosecutors built their case around the medical evidence and Lindsey's own statements to investigators. Her defense argued that she had been suffering from a severe, untreated mental health crisis at the time, one that had gone completely unrecognized by everyone around her, including herself, a phenomenon sometimes associated with concealed pregnancies carried to term under extreme psychological distress. In 2013, Lindsey Lowe was sentenced to life imprisonment. Nearly a decade later, in October of 2022, a local judge granted her a new trial and released her on bond, citing concerns about juror bias during her original proceedings. For a period of time, Lindsey lived as a free woman while the legal process continued to unfold. But the state of Tennessee appealed that decision, and the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals ultimately overturned the ruling, finding that the original trial had been conducted fairly. Her life sentence was officially reinstated, her bond was revoked, and she was returned to prison, where she remains today. The case of Lindsey Lowe remains one of the more heartbreaking entries in Tennessee's legal history, not because it involves calculated cruelty, but because it illustrates how untreated mental health crises, isolation, and shame can converge with catastrophic consequences. It has also become a case frequently cited by advocates pushing for greater awareness of maternal mental health, perinatal crisis intervention, and safe haven laws, which allow parents in crisis to safely and legally surrender a newborn with no questions asked, rather than facing an irreversible tragedy alone. If you or someone you know is a parent in crisis, safe haven laws exist in every U.S. state to allow a newborn to be safely surrendered at designated locations such as hospitals or fire stations. No judgment, no questions asked. Please know that help and options exist, even in the most frightening moments. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3. Mary Winkler. March 22, 2006. McNairy County. In the small, tight-knit town of Selmer, Tennessee, few families held a more visible or respected position than the Winklers. Matthew Winkler was the well-liked pulpit minister of the 4th Street Church of Christ, a man whose sermons drew steady crowds and whose family appeared, from every outward angle, to embody the picture-perfect image of a devoted Christian household. His wife, Mary Winkler, was seen by many in the congregation as a quiet, dutiful pastor's wife, raising their 3 young daughters while supporting her husband's ministry. Nothing about their public life hinted at the private storm building behind closed doors. On the morning of March the 22nd, 2006, that carefully maintained image shattered. Matthew Winkler was found in the couple's bedroom, having been shot in the back with a 12-gauge shotgun while he lay in bed. Mary Winkler was nowhere to be found. In the hours that followed, an urgent search began, not just for a missing woman, but for a mother who had vanished along with her 3 young daughters, all under the age of 9. Investigators traced Mary's movements across state lines, and she was eventually located and taken into custody in Orange Beach, Alabama, along Florida's Gulf Coast border, with her daughters safely by her side. The nation watched as the story unfolded on national news networks, captivated by the unimaginable idea that a minister's wife, someone so deeply embedded in a life of faith and community service, could be responsible for her husband's death. As the case developed, a very different picture of the Winkler marriage began to emerge, one starkly at odds with the pristine image the family had projected from the pews. During the trial, Mary Winkler's defense team argued that behind closed doors, she had endured a marriage marked by significant emotional abuse, financial pressure, and controlling behavior from her husband. Witnesses and testimony painted a picture of a woman who had felt trapped, isolated, and psychologically worn down over years, factors her defense argued had culminated in a moment of desperation on that March morning. The prosecution, meanwhile, pointed to the nature of the shooting itself and Mary's decision to flee the state with her daughters as evidence of a calculated act rather than a singular act of desperation. The trial became a flashpoint for broader conversations across Tennessee and the country about domestic abuse, the hidden dynamics of religious households, and how difficult it can be for outsiders, even close friends and congregants, to recognize when a marriage has become unsafe behind its public facade. In the end, the jury did not convict Mary Winkler of first-degree murder. Instead, they found her guilty of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, a verdict that reflected the complicated and deeply human nature of the case presented to them. She was sentenced to 3 years, but due to time already served and credit for evaluation at a mental health facility, she ultimately spent only 67 days in that facility along with a brief stay in jail before being released on probation. The case of Mary Winkler remains one of the most talked about and debated criminal cases in Tennessee history, not because the facts were ever in question, but because of what it forced the public to reckon with, how difficult it can be to see abuse from the outside, and how the justice system weighs the complicated, often invisible pressures that can lead someone down an irreversible path. Mary Winkler later regained custody of her 3 daughters and has largely stayed out of the public eye in the years since her release, choosing to rebuild a quiet life away from the national spotlight that once surrounded her. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse of any kind, whether physical, emotional, or financial, help is available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which offers confidential support around the clock. No one has to face that kind of isolation alone. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Pamela Rogers Turner. November 2004 through January 2005. Warren County. In the small community of McMinnville, Tennessee, Pamela Rogers Turner held a position that came with an enormous amount of trust. At 27 years old, she worked as a physical education teacher and girls basketball coach at Centertown Elementary School, a role that placed her directly in a position of authority and guardianship over the children in her care. Parents in the district sent their children to school every day trusting that the adults responsible for them, especially those in coaching and teaching roles, would protect and guide them appropriately. Turner's actions would go on to violate that trust in a way that shook the entire community. Beginning in November of 2004 and continuing through January of 2005, Turner engaged in a deeply inappropriate and unlawful relationship with a 13-year-old male student under her supervision. Investigators later determined that the contact between Turner and the child occurred across multiple locations, including the boy's own home, Turner's apartment, and even inside the school gymnasium, spaces that should have been safe, structured environments for a young student, not settings for exploitation by an authority figure. When the situation came to light, it sent shockwaves through the McMinnville community and Warren County school system. Parents and educators alike were left grappling with the disturbing reality that someone entrusted with the well-being of children had so severely abused that position. Investigators moved quickly, and the case drew significant media attention as details of the abuse of trust became public. Turner ultimately pleaded no contest to 13 counts of statutory rape and 15 counts of sexual battery by an authority figure, an acknowledgement of the severity and repeated nature of her conduct even without a formal admission of guilt in a courtroom sense. Her initial sentence, 9 months in jail, drew criticism from advocates who felt it did not reflect the seriousness of the abuse of power involved in her crimes. That criticism gained further weight after Turner's release, when she violated the strict terms of her probation by repeatedly and directly attempting to make contact with her victim online, actions that demonstrated to the court a continued disregard for the boundaries meant to protect the child she had already harmed. In 2007, her probation was formally revoked, and she was returned to custody to serve a considerably longer prison sentence as a direct consequence of those violations. The case of Pamela Rogers Turner became one of several high-profile cases across Tennessee and the broader country during that era that helped push for stronger legal protections and mandatory reporting standards within school systems, along with greater public awareness of grooming behaviors carried out by trusted authority figures. It remains a difficult but important case study in how positions of trust, whether in a classroom, a gymnasium, or on a coaching bench, can be exploited, and why vigilance, training, and clear reporting channels within schools are so critical to protecting children. If you suspect a child is being abused or groomed by an adult in a position of authority, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, available 24 hours a day, to report concerns and get guidance. Protecting children requires all of us paying attention. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5. Vanessa Coleman. January 7th, 2007. Knox County. Of all the cases that have shaken Knoxville, Tennessee, few left a deeper scar on the community than the carjacking and subsequent tragedy that claimed the lives of a young couple named Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Shannon was 21 years old, Christopher was 23, and on the night of January the 6th, 2007, the two were simply out on a date, driving home in Shannon's vehicle after an evening together. Neither of them could have imagined that within hours, their lives would be violently and permanently altered by a group of individuals who abducted them at gunpoint. The couple was forced from their vehicle and taken to a rental house in East Knoxville, a property that would later become one of the most infamous crime scenes in the state's history. Over the course of the following day, January the 7th, both Shannon and Christopher were subjected to prolonged captivity marked by severe and sustained harm at the hands of multiple assailants. Christopher Newsom did not survive his injuries. His body was discovered along railroad tracks not far from the home. Shannon Christian's body was later found inside a garbage can within the same residence where she had been held. The details that emerged from the investigation shocked not only Knoxville, but the entire country, sparking national headlines and intense public outrage over the scale of cruelty involved. As investigators worked to piece together exactly what had happened inside that house, 4 individuals were identified as directly connected to the case: Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, and a young woman named Vanessa Coleman, who was just 18 years old at the time. Coleman's role in the case differed from that of the other co-defendants. She was present in the house throughout much of the ordeal, but prosecutors determined that she did not personally carry out the physical acts against Shannon or Christopher. Instead, her culpability centered on what she chose not to do. She did not attempt to intervene. She did not contact law enforcement, and she did not attempt to help either victim escape the horrifying circumstances unfolding around her, choices that made her legally responsible for facilitating the crimes that occurred. The trial drew immense scrutiny, both because of the sheer brutality described in courtroom testimony and because of the broader questions it raised about complicity. What responsibility does a bystander carry when they are present for someone else's suffering but do not act? Prosecutors argued forcefully that Coleman's presence, her assistance to the primary attackers, and her failure to seek help for 2 people in desperate need made her every bit as responsible under the law as those who inflicted the harm directly. The defense pushed back, arguing that Coleman herself had been coerced and controlled by the men in the house, fearful for her own safety throughout the ordeal. In the end, a jury convicted Vanessa Coleman of facilitation of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. She was sentenced to 53 years in prison. Her co-defendants faced their own separate trials and sentences, with Lamarcus Davidson, identified as the ringleader, receiving the most severe sentence among the group. The case fundamentally changed the way Knoxville and much of Tennessee thought about carjacking-related violence and the vulnerabilities faced by young people simply going about their evening plans. Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom's families became tireless advocates in the years that followed, pushing for updated legislation, victims' rights reforms, and greater public awareness around violent abduction cases. Their story remains one of the most referenced in Tennessee true crime history, not only for the horror of what occurred, but for the resilience their families showed in transforming unimaginable loss into advocacy for others. If you or someone you love has been affected by violent crime, the National Center for Victims of Crime offers resources, support, and guidance for navigating the aftermath. No family should have to face that kind of grief without support. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6. Raynella Leath. March 13, 2003. Knox County. Few cases in East Tennessee have generated as much speculation, media fascination, and courtroom drama as the story of Raynella Leath, a woman the press would eventually nickname the Black Widow for the suspicious pattern that seemed to follow her through 2 marriages, both of which ended with her husband no longer alive. The story begins over a decade before the case that would ultimately bring Raynella Leath into the national spotlight. In 1992, her then-husband, Knox County District Attorney Ed Dossett, died under circumstances initially attributed to a cattle-related accident on their rural property, a tragic but seemingly explainable farm accident at the time. It was only years later, when investigators revisited the case with fresh eyes, that toxicology findings revealed lethal levels of morphine in his system at the time of his death, details that cast an entirely new and troubling light on what had once been filed away as an accident. More than a decade after Dossett's death, tragedy struck the Leath household again. On March 13, 2003, Raynella's second husband, David Leath, was found in their bed, having sustained a fatal gunshot wound. The eerie parallel between the 2 deaths, both husbands, both under circumstances that initially seemed explainable but later raised significant red flags, prompted investigators to take an intense second look at Raynella Leath's history. What followed was one of the most legally complicated and drawn-out prosecutions in Tennessee history. Raynella Leath's first trial for the death of David Leath in 2009 resulted in a hung jury, with jurors unable to reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial in 2010 resulted in a conviction, but that conviction was later overturned due to findings of judicial misconduct during the proceedings, an extraordinary legal development that sent the case back to square one and kept the community waiting for resolution for years afterward. A third and final trial took place in May of 2017, more than 14 years after David Leath's death. In a dramatic turn that stunned courtroom observers, the presiding judge issued a directed verdict of acquittal partway through the proceedings, ruling that the state had simply failed to provide sufficient evidence proving that David Leath's death was the result of a homicide rather than a suicide. With that ruling, Raynella Leath was legally cleared of all charges connected to her husband's death, bringing the 14-year legal saga to an abrupt and, for many observers, deeply unsatisfying close. Raynella Leath spent the remaining years of her life as a free woman, having never been convicted in either her first husband's or her second husband's death. She passed away at the age of 77 on April 4, 2026, taking with her whatever truth existed behind 2 of the most scrutinized deaths in East Tennessee history. To this day, her case remains a subject of fascination for true crime researchers and legal analysts alike, a rare example of a case that never reached a definitive legal conclusion despite decades of investigation, 3 separate trials, and an entire community left to draw its own conclusions. The Raynella Leath case serves as an important reminder of how difficult circumstantial cases can be to prosecute, particularly when key evidence is contested, decades pass between events, and legal proceedings themselves become part of the controversy. It underscores the importance of thorough, careful forensic investigation from the very first moment a suspicious death is reported. If you have information about an unresolved case in your community, please consider contacting your local law enforcement's cold case unit. Some answers only come when someone is willing to speak up. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Joyce Watkins. June 26, 1987. Davidson County. Some of the most important stories a true crime channel can tell are not stories of guilt, but stories of a system getting it wrong and the long, difficult road some people walk to reclaim their names. The case of Joyce Watkins is exactly that kind of story, a nearly 3-decade fight for justice that ended not in punishment, but in exoneration. In 1987, Joyce Watkins was a young woman living in Nashville, Tennessee, helping to care for her 4-year-old niece, Brandy Taylor, alongside her boyfriend, Charlie Green. On June the 26th of that year, tragedy struck. Brandy Taylor sustained catastrophic injuries and did not survive. In the investigation that followed, suspicion fell on Joyce Watkins and Charlie Green, the 2 adults who had most recently been caring for the child. Based largely on the medical understanding and forensic standards available at the time, both were charged, tried, and ultimately convicted in connection with Brandy's death. For the next 27 years, Joyce Watkins lived behind bars, insisting throughout her incarceration that she had not caused harm to the niece she loved. Charlie Green maintained the same position. Both were eventually paroled in 2015, released back into a world that had changed enormously since their convictions, but still carrying the weight of a conviction that continued to define how the public saw them. What happened next is the part of this story that matters most. In the years following their release, the Davidson County District Attorney's Conviction Review Unit, a division specifically created to revisit convictions where new evidence or updated forensic understanding might change the outcome, took on Joyce Watkins' case. Medical experts brought in during this review conducted an exhaustive re-examination of the original evidence using modern forensic and medical knowledge that simply had not existed at the time of the original trial. Their findings were striking. The fatal injuries Brandy Taylor sustained had occurred hours before she was ever placed into Joyce Watkins' care that day, a timeline that made it medically impossible for Watkins to have been responsible for the injuries that led to her niece's death. On January the 12th, 2022, nearly 35 years after Brandy Taylor's death and 7 years after her release on parole, Joyce Watkins was officially and fully exonerated. Charlie Green, who had passed away by that time, was exonerated posthumously alongside her, finally clearing both of their names of a crime the evidence now showed they did not commit. Joyce Watkins' case stands as a sobering reminder of how forensic science evolves over time, and how convictions based on the best available understanding of one era can later be proven tragically incorrect as that understanding advances. It also highlights the critical importance of conviction review units and innocence projects across the country, dedicated teams of investigators, attorneys, and medical experts working to identify and correct wrongful convictions long after the original trial has concluded. For Joyce Watkins, exoneration could never give back the 27 years she spent in prison, but it did finally give her back her name, and the truth that she never should have lost her freedom in the first place. If you believe you or a loved one may have been wrongfully convicted, organizations like the Innocence Project work to investigate and pursue exoneration for individuals across the country. Justice, even when delayed by decades, still matters. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Cyntoia Brown Long. August 10, 2004. Davidson County. Few cases in modern Tennessee history sparked as widespread and national conversation about juvenile justice, sex trafficking, and the legal system's treatment of child victims as the case of Cyntoia Brown Long. In 2004, Cyntoia Brown was just 16 years old, a runaway who had fallen into the hands of a man who forced her into sex trafficking, controlling her through manipulation, coercion, and fear. She had no stable home to return to, no support system positioned to intervene, and existed in circumstances that placed her in extreme danger on a near-daily basis, entirely at the mercy of the adults exploiting her. On August the 10th of that year, a 43-year-old man named Johnny Mitchell Allen brought Cyntoia to his home. What happened inside that home would become the center of a case that divided public opinion and eventually captured headlines across the entire country. Cyntoia, fearing for her life and believing Allen was reaching for a weapon, shot him. She was arrested and charged as an adult despite being a minor at the time, and was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that, under Tennessee law at the time, would have required her to serve at least 51 years before even becoming eligible for parole. For years, Cyntoia's case remained relatively unknown outside of Tennessee legal circles. That changed dramatically as advocates, journalists, and eventually celebrities began drawing national attention to the details of her case, specifically the fact that a 16-year-old trafficking victim, someone who was legally a child and the victim of ongoing sexual exploitation, had been sentenced as though she were an adult criminal acting with full autonomy. The hashtag #FreeCyntoia spread rapidly across social media, and the case became a flashpoint in broader national conversations about how the justice system treats minors who are victims of trafficking, and whether self-defense claims by trafficking victims are given fair consideration in courtrooms. The pressure and awareness campaign ultimately reached the desk of Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam. After reviewing her case, Haslam made the decision to grant Cyntoia clemency, commuting her sentence and paving the way for her release on parole. On August the 7th, 2019, after serving 15 years, Cyntoia Brown walked out of prison as a free woman. In the years since her release, Cyntoia Brown Long has become a prominent advocate for criminal justice reform and support services for trafficking survivors, using her own story to push for legislative changes aimed at protecting other minors caught in similar circumstances. Her case remains one of the most cited examples in discussions about how the justice system should distinguish between a minor who commits an act of violence out of desperation and self-preservation and an adult offender acting with full legal culpability. It also played a significant role in Tennessee's own legislative reforms surrounding how the state handles juvenile sentencing in cases involving trafficking victims. If you or someone you know may be a victim of trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is available around the clock to provide confidential support, safety planning, and resources. No one should have to face that kind of exploitation alone, and help exists. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9. Gaile Owens. February 19, 1985. Shelby County. In the suburban Memphis community of Bartlett, Tennessee, the Owens household appeared, at least from the outside, like countless other American families in the mid-1980s. Gaile Owens was a wife and mother, married to her husband, Ron Owens, raising their children in a quiet neighborhood. But behind the closed doors of that household, a very different reality was unfolding, one that would not come fully into public understanding until decades later. On February the 19th, 1985, Ron Owens was found dead in the couple's suburban Memphis home, having sustained fatal injuries from a tire iron. As investigators dug into the case, they uncovered a deeply troubling arrangement. Gaile Owens had hired a man named Sidney Porterfield to carry out the attack against her own husband. The revelation stunned the community, and Gaile Owens was swiftly charged, tried, and convicted of first-degree murder for her role in arranging her husband's death. She was sentenced to death, becoming one of a small number of women in Tennessee's history to receive a capital sentence. For more than 2 decades, Gaile Owens remained on death row, her case moving slowly through the appeals process while, largely outside public view, a much fuller picture of her marriage to Ron Owens began to emerge. Advocates and legal teams working on her behalf uncovered extensive evidence that Gaile had endured decades of severe physical, psychological, and sexual abuse throughout her marriage, a pattern of domestic terror that had never been fully presented or weighed during her original trial. This evidence painted a picture of a woman who had lived for years under conditions of extreme control and fear, circumstances her original defense had not been able to adequately bring before the court. As this evidence came to light and gained public and legal attention, momentum grew around the question of whether Gaile Owens' death sentence reflected true justice, or whether it represented a system that had failed to account for the abuse she endured leading up to that day in 1985. In 2010, Tennessee Governor Phil Bredesen made the decision to commute her death sentence to life imprisonment, citing the overwhelming evidence of the abuse she had suffered throughout her marriage. That commutation opened the door to parole eligibility, and in October of 2011, after more than 25 years behind bars, Gaile Owens was released on parole. The case of Gaile Owens became a significant touchstone in national conversations about how the justice system accounts, or fails to account, for a defendant's history as a survivor of domestic abuse. It raised difficult but necessary questions about how courts weigh coercive control, fear, and prolonged trauma when someone commits a violent act against their abuser, and it contributed meaningfully to broader legal and advocacy movements pushing for domestic violence history to be more thoroughly considered during both trial and sentencing phases across the country. Gaile Owens' story remains a powerful, if difficult, example of how the full context of a person's life circumstances can dramatically reshape the pursuit of justice, even decades after a conviction. If you or someone you know is living with domestic abuse, please remember that the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available every hour of every day to provide confidential support and safety planning. Abuse thrives in silence, and reaching out can be the first step towards safety. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10. Natasha Cornett. April 6, 1997. Greene County. Few cases capture the sheer unpredictability of tragedy, quite like the story of the Leath family, a devoted Jehovah's Witness family from Powell, Tennessee, whose lives intersected for only a matter of minutes with a group of troubled teenagers on a chaotic road trip, an intersection that would end in unimaginable loss. The group at the center of this case originated not in Tennessee, but in Pikeville, Kentucky, where 6 disenfranchised teenagers, led in large part by 18-year-old Natasha Cornett, set out together on an aimless, directionless journey away from homes and lives many of them felt disconnected from. What began as a chaotic escape gradually became something far darker as the group made its way south, eventually crossing into Tennessee. On April 6, 1997, the group stopped at a rest area along Interstate 81 in Greene County, Tennessee. There, they encountered Vidar Lillelid, his wife Delphina, and their 2 young children, 6-year-old Tabitha and 2-year-old Peter, a family who had stopped at the same rest area while sharing their faith with travelers, entirely unaware of the danger about to enter their lives. The group of teenagers, seeking to carjack the family's van, forced the Lillelids away from the rest area and down a remote gravel road nearby. What happened next became one of the most devastating cases in Tennessee history. The family was lined up, and all 4 members of the Lillelid family were shot. Vidar, Delphina, and young Tabitha did not survive their injuries. Remarkably, 2-year-old Peter survived a gunshot wound to the head, though the injury left him with permanent, lifelong disabilities. The senseless nature of the attack, a family targeted at random simply for the vehicle they were driving, sent shockwaves through Greene County and the entire state, striking fear into communities far beyond where the crime occurred. Law enforcement quickly identified the group of teenagers, apprehending them not long after the attack as they continued attempting to flee in the stolen van. As the case moved toward prosecution, Natasha Cornett, identified as the individual most central to the group's actions that day, faced the possibility of the death penalty given the scale and severity of what had occurred. In order to avoid capital punishment, she ultimately pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder for the harm caused to young Peter. Natasha Cornett was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 25 years, a sentence that ensures she will spend the remainder of her life incarcerated. She is currently serving her sentence at the Tennessee Prison for Women. Her co-defendants face their own separate trials and sentences based on their individual levels of involvement in the attack. The Lillard family's story became a defining tragedy for Greene County and much of East Tennessee, a devastating illustration of how quickly an ordinary roadside stop can turn catastrophic. In the years since, Peter Lillard, the sole survivor of that day, has continued to live with the physical and emotional impact of what happened to his family, and the surviving Lillard relatives have worked to preserve the memory of Vidar, Delphina, and Tabitha, ensuring their story is remembered not just as a crime, but as the story of a family who never got the chance to see their children grow up. If this case has moved you, consider supporting organizations that provide crisis intervention and mental health resources for at-risk youth, as early intervention can be one of the most powerful tools in preventing tragedies like this one before they happen. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. That brings us to the end of today's journey through 10 of Tennessee's most talked about cases involving women whose stories left a lasting mark on courtrooms, communities, and the families who were forever changed by what happened. From the wooded campus in Knoxville to a quiet parsonage in Selmer, from a rest stop along Interstate 81 to a suburban home in Bartlett, these cases span decades and every corner of this state, but they share something in common. Each one is a reminder that behind every headline, every court transcript, and every verdict, there are real people, victims, families, and communities who carried the weight of these events long after the cameras stopped rolling and the courtrooms went quiet. Some of these stories ended in accountability. Others ended in exoneration, decades too late for the years that had already been lost. And some, like the case of Raynella Leath, never reached a resolution the public could fully agree on at all. That's the reality of true crime. It isn't always tidy, and it doesn't always give us the closure we're looking for. But telling these stories, carefully, respectfully, and accurately, matters. It keeps victims' names alive. It holds systems accountable. And it reminds all of us just how thin the line can be between an ordinary day and a tragedy. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Cold Case Hour. If any of these cases raised questions for you, or if you'd like us to cover a specific case in a future episode, drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you haven't already, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive when it drops. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.